trucker saved a pregnant woman at a gas station, then uncovered dark secrets that changed his life forever. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Jackson's truck thundered along the icy highway, slicing through the biting cold as a relentless snowfall blanketed everything in sight. Each mile brought him closer to home after months of driving cross-country, a job that kept him away from his wife, Emily, more than he liked. His truck's cab was a rare haven of warmth against the winter storm raging outside, and as he drove, his gaze often drifted to a small photograph dangling from the rearview mirror, a snapshot of Emily, smiling brightly, her face brimming with the joy he remembered. Christmas was only a few days away, and anticipation tingled through him. He could practically hear her laughter and picture the sparkle in her eyes. After a busy season of late-night calls and rushed check-ins, he'd finally get to hold her close, enjoy quiet moments, and celebrate the holiday season together. In the glove compartment lay a small, meticulously wrapped box. Nestled in festive tissue paper was a golden necklace he'd spent days picking out, hoping it would express the depth of his love and the joy he felt about coming home. As he pressed on through the thickening snow, his heart grew warm despite the icy road. He knew the route like the back of his hand. The familiar twists, the long stretches of barren land, and the dim lights of occasional homes dotting the way. The quiet emptiness had a sort of beauty to it, though tonight it felt more desolate than usual. Every so often, a single car would pass him by, its headlights swallowed almost immediately by the swirling snow. Soon the soft glow of the city lights appeared on the horizon, twinkling like beacons of comfort and warmth. He pulled off at a truck stop, deciding to walk the final stretch to their apartment, a little surprise for Emily, who wouldn't expect him back so soon. Wrapping himself in his thick coat, Jackson stepped out, taking a deep breath of the chilly air that tingled in his lungs. The town was alive with holiday cheer, the streets decorated with bright wreaths and lights strung along the storefronts. People bustled along the sidewalks, their faces hidden behind scarves, but their eyes sparkling with the same joy that filled Jackson's heart. As he walked, memories of his life with Emily drifted through his mind. Quiet breakfasts together, lazy Sunday afternoons, and even the occasional argument, each one leaving a mark on the life they shared. Now, as he climbed the stairs of their apartment building, he could almost hear the familiar hum of their conversations, the little moments that made everything feel so right. "Evening, Mr. Rogers," he called to the elderly neighbor shuffling down the hall, bundled in layers as he headed out for the night. "Evening, Jackson," Mr. Rogers replied with a grin. "Lovely weather, isn't it?" Jackson chuckled, nodding politely. "Not too bad, just a bit of holiday magic in the air." As he reached the door to their apartment, he paused, a mischievous smile tugging at his lips. Quietly, he pressed the doorbell, stepping back slightly to hide from view. He pictured Emily answering the door, her eyes lighting up with joy at the sight of him. His heart thumped with anticipation as he waited for her to open the door. But seconds ticked by, and then a full minute, with no answer. Frowning, he leaned forward and rang the bell again. The silence from the other side only deepened the strange unease creeping up his spine. "Emily?" he called softly, pressing his ear against the door. There was nothing but silence. After a few moments, he dug into his pocket, fumbling with his keys as he unlocked the door, the lock clicking open with a strange finality. The apartment was eerily still, with no sign of life or warmth. Stepping inside, he called out again, "Emily, I'm home! Surprise!" The words echoed through the empty space, bouncing back at him in the cold silence. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of dust and abandonment. His heart sank as he closed the door behind him, the warmth he'd felt on the drive quickly giving way to a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The living room was as they had left it, but there was a stillness to it that felt wrong, as if it had been untouched for days. The cushions on the couch were perfectly in place. The television screen was a dark, blank rectangle, and there were no signs of Emily's lively presence anywhere. He moved further in, calling her name with increasing urgency, but his voice seemed to disappear into the silence, swallowed by the walls that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. A growing sense of dread clawed at him as he walked through the apartment, searching for some clue, anything to explain why Emily wasn't here. His heart pounded, a steady thud echoing in his ears as he entered the bedroom, the last place he hadn't checked. The bed was made, the sheets untouched, and a thin layer of dust covered the surface of the dresser. He knew then, with a sudden, hollow certainty, that Emily hadn't been here for days. Desperation and confusion welled up inside him, and he stumbled back into the living room, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Finally, his gaze fell upon a small piece of paper on the kitchen counter. With trembling hands, he picked it up, recognizing Emily's neat handwriting. The words seemed to blur as he read, "Jackson, I'm sorry. It didn't work out. I've realized I need more, and I deserve happiness. I've met someone else, and I hope you can find the same for yourself. Goodbye." For a moment, Jackson couldn't breathe. The words felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. His hands shook as he crushed the note in his grip, feeling an unfamiliar anger and grief clawing at him, each emotion stronger than he'd ever felt before. With a strangled cry, he threw the crumpled paper against the wall, watching as it fluttered to the ground, a pitiful end to the promise of a life he'd thought was theirs. The apartment was silent once more, the walls bearing witness to his heartbreak. Jackson sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, feeling the weight of emptiness settle over him. The photograph of Emily, still dangling from his rearview mirror, was now just a haunting reminder of a love he'd lost without warning. Alone in the dark, with only the hollow echo of Emily's goodbye, Jackson's journey home had come to an unexpected and devastating end. His mind raced with unanswered questions, each one piercing deeper than the last. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had spent his life with, was gone, her sudden departure leaving him shattered. How had it come to this? What had he missed? The shock of her words was still raw, and yet the ache for an explanation overshadowed even his hurt. He needed to understand why Emily had left, and he wouldn't rest until he did. The next morning, with hardly any sleep and a foggy mind, Jackson gathered himself and decided to search for answers. He left the apartment and walked through the familiar streets that led to the restaurant where Emily had worked for years. It was a small, bustling place known for its lively atmosphere and close-knit team, and he'd often visited to catch glimpses of her during a break or surprise her with a meal. He remembered their laughter shared over quick lunches and the way her face would light up when she spotted him through the kitchen window. As he pushed open the door to the restaurant, the smell of cooking food and the sound of clinking dishes greeted him, stark reminders of the life they once shared. But today, there was a heaviness to the place that felt foreign. His gaze swept the room, searching for any familiar faces among the staff. It wasn't long before he spotted Sarah, the restaurant manager, bustling behind the counter. Sarah noticed him almost immediately, her face registering a mix of surprise and, Jackson thought, maybe something else, an expression he couldn't quite read. She put down the notepad she was holding and walked over, her eyes studying him with a hint of concern. "Jackson," she greeted him, her voice low and hesitant. I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, I didn't expect to be here under these circumstances either," Jackson replied, his voice strained. "Sarah, do you have a minute? I need to ask you something about Emily." Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. She motioned for him to follow her to a quieter corner, away from the other employees and customers. Once they were settled, she looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "What happened, Sarah?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. "I came home last night and she's gone. Just gone. She left a note, but that's it. No explanation, no warning. Do you know anything?" Sarah sighed, glancing around before she spoke. "Jackson, I'm really sorry about all of this. I wish I could tell you more, but Emily didn't say much to anyone here. She was distant, kept to herself. Honestly, we were all a bit worried about her." Jackson's jaw tightened as he listened, trying to control the swell of emotion in his chest. "There has to be something, Sarah. She mentioned in her note that she's found someone else, that she's happier now. I need to understand how she could just leave like that." Sarah hesitated, her hands wringing nervously. "Look, Jackson, all I know is she started spending more time with certain people outside of work. She seemed different. I noticed she would come in looking a bit more polished, wearing jewelry she didn't used to wear, but she kept her distance from us. almost like she didn't want anyone asking questions. "Do you know who this new person is?" Jackson pressed, the urgency evident in his tone. He could sense there was something Sarah wasn't saying. "From what I understand, she was spending time with Martin," Sarah finally admitted, lowering her voice. "He's the owner of that upscale restaurant downtown, the place with the private parties and expensive wine tastings." "Martin?" Jackson's brows knit together in confusion. He'd heard of the man, a businessman known for his wealth and connections, but also for his shady reputation. People whispered about his dealings, his rumored ties to less than reputable circles. The idea of Emily being involved with someone like Martin was unfathomable to him. "Are you saying Emily left with him?" Jackson's voice faltered, disbelief washing over him. Sarah nodded slowly. "That's the impression we all had. She started spending a lot of time around his place, attending his parties. Some of us were concerned, but she kept brushing us off, saying it was nothing. I think she was drawn to the lifestyle he offered, something more glamorous than what she had here." Jackson's stomach churned. He struggled to reconcile this new image of Emily with the woman he knew. Why hadn't she said anything? If she wanted something more, why hadn't she come to him? "I thought we were happy," he whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. "We made plans together. We were building a life." Sarah reached out, resting a hand on his arm, her expression sympathetic. "Sometimes people change, Jackson. Sometimes they want things they never realized before. It's not your fault." But her words felt hollow, bouncing off the walls of disbelief that had formed around him. He muttered a quick thanks, his mind swirling as he exited the restaurant and stepped back into the street. The cold air hit him like a slap, sharp and sobering. The more he thought about it, the more questions gnawed at him. Why had Emily hidden this from him? What had he missed? And what kind of man was Martin, that he could draw her away from their life so completely? He found himself wandering, his feet taking him toward the part of town where Martin's restaurant was located. He'd never been there before, never had a reason to venture into the world of wealth and power Martin inhabited. But now, his curiosity and his desperation for answers drove him forward. As he approached the restaurant, its elegant facade loomed before him, the glass doors reflecting his own bewildered expression. He lingered across the street, watching as well-dressed patrons came and went, their laughter and chatter spilling into the cold night air. He wondered if Emily was inside, wrapped up in this new life she'd chosen, surrounded by people he could never understand. Jackson turned away, feeling an ache settle deep within him. For the first time, he faced the possibility that Emily was truly gone, her heart lost to a life he would never be able to reach. And yet, he couldn't let it go, not without understanding why. With a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, Jackson walked away, his journey for answers just beginning. Jackson's mind was clouded, haunted by what Sarah had revealed about Emily and Martin. The more he tried to piece together the clues, the less sense it all made. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and half-hearted attempts to distract himself. Yet each moment was shadowed by thoughts of Emily and Martin and how she could abandon everything they had built. Finally, after one particularly restless night, Jackson made a decision. He had to see it for himself. See her and, if possible, confront Martin. Maybe then he would find the closure he needed to move forward. That evening, he found himself back at Martin's upscale restaurant. The glowing lights of the establishment cast a golden hue on the sidewalk, and the laughter from inside created a strange mix of familiarity and alienation. Jackson lingered outside for a moment, watching the patrons as they sipped expensive cocktails and chatted around marble tables. It was a life he and Emily had only dreamed of, but had never truly wanted, or so he thought. As he waited, Jackson's eyes wandered to a corner of the restaurant, where he caught a glimpse of a woman with dark hair laughing at something someone had said. It was Emily. His heart clenched as he saw her, her smile bright and effortless, in a way that felt foreign to him. The person she appeared to be here was someone he barely recognized, a stark contrast to the woman he had known. And there, beside her, was Martin, a tall, imposing man with sharp features and an air of practiced charm. Jackson's grip tightened around his coat as he watched Martin place a hand on Emily's shoulder, leaning in to whisper something that made her laugh again. The sight was a punch to his gut, a visual confirmation of the betrayal he had only been able to imagine until now. It was one thing to know she had left, but it was another to see her moving on so easily, in the company of a man like Martin. As if sensing his gaze, Emily glanced toward the window and froze when her eyes met his. For a brief moment, the lively expression on her face vanished, replaced by a look of shock and something else. Guilt, perhaps. She glanced away quickly, saying something to Martin before slipping out the back of the restaurant, signaling that she wanted Jackson to meet her outside. Jackson followed her, his heart pounding, unsure of what he would say, or if he even wanted to hear her explanations. He found her standing in a shadowed alley behind the restaurant, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of defensiveness and shame. "What are you doing here, Jackson?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. Jackson stared at her, searching her face for answers. "I think that's my question, Emily. What are you doing here? What happened to us?" Emily's gaze dropped, and she bit her lip, hesitating before responding. "Things changed, Jackson. I changed? It's complicated." "Complicated?" he echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. "We were happy, Emily. We had plans, a future, and you threw it all away for this?" He gestured toward the restaurant, the words heavy with bitterness. "For Martin?" Emily looked up, her expression hardening. "Don't make it sound so simple. I needed more than what we had, Jackson. I needed stability. Martin gave me that." "Stability?" Jackson scoffed. "Since when was our life unstable? We were building something together, working hard. But that wasn't enough, was it? You wanted a shortcut. The glamour, the money." His voice was rising, each word carrying the weight of betrayal. Emily flinched, her defensive expression fading, as she whispered, "I didn't mean for you to get hurt, Jackson. I didn't want this life anymore. I'm sorry." The apology felt empty, like a formality, and Jackson sensed it was the only thing she could offer. He shook his head, a mix of anger and sorrow flooding him. "I thought you loved me, Emily. I thought we were a team." Emily looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Maybe it's better if you don't try to understand." Jackson's fists clenched, frustration boiling within him. "What's that supposed to mean? You've left me with nothing but questions, Emily. Don't I deserve the truth?" She looked back at him, a flash of regret in her eyes. "The truth is, I fell out of love with that life, with us. And Martin offered me a way out. I took it. I'm sorry, Jackson, but it's done now." With those words, she turned and walked back toward the entrance, leaving him standing alone in the shadows. The weight of her betrayal settled heavily on his shoulders as he watched her disappear into the warm glow of the restaurant, back into the world she had chosen over him. Jackson walked away from the alley, feeling a profound sense of emptiness. For so long, he had believed in the life they were building together, only to find that she had cast it aside with little regard for the future they had dreamed of. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by someone who had chosen wealth and comfort over love and loyalty. As he made his way back home, he felt as if a door had closed on the life he had known. There would be no going back, no repairing what had been broken. The following day, Jackson's mind was still reeling from his confrontation with Emily. Sleep had been elusive, and he was haunted by her words, the bitterness of betrayal settling deeper into his soul. But there was one thought that kept him moving forward: Martin. He knew he couldn't fully heal until he faced the man who had replaced him in Emily's life. Jackson decided he'd confront Martin directly, seeking not just answers but a sense of closure for everything he had lost. That evening, he returned to the restaurant, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for the encounter. He entered with a calm determination, making his way through the upscale atmosphere of polished marble floors, expensive chandeliers, and faint classical music playing in the background. He didn't have to wait long before Martin appeared, impeccably dressed, exuding a confident air. Martin noticed Jackson almost immediately and paused, his expression momentarily betraying surprise before he approached with a calculated smile. "Jackson, right?" Martin's voice was smooth, his tone slightly amused. "I heard you were looking for me." Jackson clenched his fists, resisting the urge to let his anger show. "You and I need to talk. Alone." Martin raised an eyebrow, but nodded, leading Jackson toward a quieter corner of the restaurant. As they settled, Martin leaned back casually, crossing his arms and regarding Jackson with a mixture of curiosity and arrogance. "What is it you want to know, Jackson?" Martin asked, his voice almost patronizing. "I think you've already seen the situation for what it is." Jackson kept his gaze steady, his voice cold. "What I want to know is how you managed to steal away everything I had. Emily and I, we were building a life together. And then you came along." Martin's smirk widened. "Steal? That's an interesting choice of words. Emily made her own decisions. She wanted something more, something better than what you could give her. I didn't have to steal her away. I just showed her what life could be like without all the struggle." Jackson's jaw tightened as Martin's words stung deeper than he expected. "So, to you, it's all just about money and appearances? That's what she wanted?" "Everyone wants stability," Martin replied, his tone as smooth as silk. "And yes, maybe a little comfort, a taste of the finer things. Can you blame her? You think you were enough, but clearly you weren't." Jackson felt his anger flare, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't here to let Martin get the better of him. He was here to see who this man truly was. "Let me ask you something, Martin. Do you honestly care about her, or was she just another trophy to add to your collection?" Jackson's tone was laced with disdain, challenging Martin's intentions. Martin's smile faded, and for a brief moment, a flicker of something darker flashed in his eyes. "Be careful, Jackson. You're not in a position to make accusations. Emily's chosen to be with me, and you'd do well to accept it." The tension between them was palpable, both men locked in a silent battle of wills. Jackson could see through Martin's facade, the practiced charm that hid something cold and calculated. He didn't care about Emily in the way Jackson had. To Martin, she was simply a possession, a way to feed his own ego. "I'll accept that she's gone," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "But I won't forget what kind of man you are, Martin. And one day, Emily will see it too." Martin chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "You're welcome to your opinions, Jackson. But remember, I'm the one who has her now. Whatever life you had together, it's over." With those words, Martin stood, casting Jackson a final, dismissive glance before walking away. Jackson watched him go, a mix of anger and sorrow churning within him. He felt the weight of reality pressing down on him, knowing that he would have to accept that Emily had moved on, even if it was with a man who could never truly value her. The encounter with Martin left Jackson feeling hollow, like a shell of the man he once was. Each word from Martin replayed in his mind, a chorus of accusations that picked at his self-worth, his life choices, his very identity. He hadn't just lost Emily. He had lost his sense of purpose, his confidence, and even the future he'd once dreamed of building. Jackson returned to his empty apartment that night, where silence pressed in like an unwanted guest. He moved through the space with a growing sense of detachment, noting the little things that still lingered of Emily, the faint smell of her perfume, a stray hair tie on the bathroom counter, the way the pillows on the couch were arranged just as she liked them. But instead of comfort, these reminders only deepened his grief. As days passed, Jackson found himself sinking further into despair. He took to numbing his mind with bottles of whiskey, the burn of the liquor offering a temporary relief from the ache that filled his chest. Hours turned to days, and the world around him began to blur as he fell deeper into a haze of alcohol and sleepless nights. The once warm, cozy apartment quickly became a cluttered mess. Dishes piled up in the sink, discarded bottles rolled across the floor, and dust gathered on every surface. Jackson could feel himself unraveling, but he couldn't seem to find the strength to care. He was drifting, isolated in his sorrow, clinging to memories that seemed to haunt him no matter how hard he tried to push them away. One early morning, just as the first light of Christmas Day began to creep through the window, a knock sounded at Jackson's door. He ignored it at first, too exhausted and defeated to care, but the knocking persisted, loud and steady, pulling him from the fog he had wrapped himself in. Reluctantly, Jackson stumbled to the door, opening it to find his elderly neighbor, Mr. Rogers, standing there, his weathered face filled with concern. "Jackson," Mr. Rogers said gently, looking him over with a mixture of worry and compassion. "I know it's early, but I couldn't help but notice. It's been a while since I've seen you out and about." Jackson sighed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Sorry, Mr. Rogers, just going through some things." Mr. Rogers didn't press, instead stepping inside uninvited and closing the door behind him. His eyes scanned the disarray of the apartment, but he said nothing, choosing instead to guide Jackson to the couch and sit down beside him. "Sometimes," Mr. Rogers began, his voice low and thoughtful, "life doesn't go the way we expect. We lose things, people, dreams, and it can be tempting to let ourselves sink, to give in to the pain. But Jackson, that's not what life is for." Jackson listened in silence, the words seeping into the cracks of his heart. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. "It's hard, losing someone," Mr. Rogers continued, his gaze distant as if recalling his own sorrows. "But living through it, surviving the heartbreak, that's the true test of strength." Jackson looked down, shame beginning to seep in. I don't know if I have that strength, Mr. Rogers. Emily left me, moved on so easily. And now, I don't know who I am without her." Mr. Rogers placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're still Jackson. You're still the man who has endured so much. You're still the man who helped neighbors, who worked hard, who loved deeply. That part of you hasn't disappeared, even if it feels buried right now." The words resonated with Jackson in a way that surprised him. He thought of the person he had once been, the life he had before everything fell apart. There was a time, before Emily, when he had dreams of his own, ambitions that didn't rely on anyone else. Perhaps that version of himself was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. Mr. Rogers stayed for a while, sharing stories of his own losses, his own battles with loneliness. They talked until the sun was fully up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jackson felt the weight in his chest begin to lighten, if only just a little. As Mr. Rogers prepared to leave, he gave Jackson a final, encouraging pat on the back. "Take it one day at a time, son. Don't let this break you. Let it be the start of something new." With those words, Mr. Rogers left, leaving Jackson alone in his apartment. But somehow, he no longer felt as isolated. The silence no longer seemed as oppressive, the emptiness not as consuming. He took a deep breath, feeling a spark of determination ignite within him. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. 2 weeks had passed since Jackson had begun his journey to recovery. The wound left by Emily's departure still ached, but the raw edges had softened just enough for him to start moving through the motions of life again. At times, it felt as though her absence was a weight pressing on his chest. But Mr. Rogers' words lingered in his thoughts, providing a quiet reassurance that he hadn't been completely abandoned. In the solitude of his apartment, Jackson had started to find solace in simple routines. The familiar motions of washing dishes, sweeping the floors, and organizing his belongings became small rituals, giving him a sense of control he hadn't felt in weeks. He would open the windows every morning to let in the cold winter air, the crispness refreshing his mind, allowing him to shake off the fog of grief, if only for a little while. Each morning, after tidying up, he'd lace up his boots and go for a walk. These walks were slow and meditative, an opportunity to clear his mind and feel the world moving around him. He'd pass through the quiet streets, watching as people went about their lives, greeting each other with familiar warmth. Children laughing and playing, the distant sound of dogs barking, all reminders of life continuing, unchanged by his personal heartache. Returning to work was perhaps the hardest adjustment. The sight of his truck, with its sturdy familiarity, brought both comfort and a pang of sadness. He remembered how he'd driven it on countless roads, imagining each journey as one step closer to returning home to Emily. Now, the truck felt different, as though it carried a weight all its own. Yet, there was something grounding and slipping back into the rhythm of work, focusing on the road ahead, the hum of the engine a constant reminder that, like everything, life kept moving forward. Despite everything, there were moments, small, fleeting ones, where he felt a strange sense of peace. There was no rushing or pushing forward, just a quiet acceptance of where he was, letting the days unfold in their own time. He didn't know what the future held, and the idea of moving on felt daunting. But for now, he held on to these small comforts, these moments of calm that kept him going, one day at a time. One bitterly cold evening, Jackson found himself low on gas as he drove down a quiet stretch of highway just outside town. He spotted a small, dimly lit gas station and pulled in, grateful for the opportunity to fill up and warm his hands. As he stepped out of his truck, he noticed a woman standing outside the gas station's convenience store, clutching her stomach with one hand and holding onto the wall with the other. She was clearly in distress, her face pale and strained. Without a second thought, Jackson approached her. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, concern flooding his voice. The woman, dressed in a thin coat that seemed inadequate for the weather, looked up at him with a faint, desperate smile. I don't think so. I think it's the baby. It's coming." Jackson's eyes widened in alarm. You're having the baby? Right now?" She nodded weakly, a grimace of pain crossing her face as she took a shaky breath. "I was on my way to the hospital, but my car broke down. The station clerk called for an ambulance, but they said the roads are icy and there's a delay." Jackson looked around, feeling the urgency of the situation settle over him. The gas station was deserted, and the snow was starting to fall heavier, coating everything in a thick white blanket. There was no time to wait. "Come on," he said firmly, slipping his arm under her shoulders to support her. "My truck is just over here. I'll drive you to the hospital." The woman looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. He helped her into the passenger seat, carefully buckling her in as she struggled to control her breathing. Once she was secure, he ran around to the driver's side, turning the heat up as high as it would go. "Just hang in there," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. "We'll get you to the hospital as soon as we can." As he drove, the woman's breathing grew faster, more labored, and Jackson could tell she was fighting through intense contractions. She clutched her stomach tightly, her face twisted in pain, and he could hear her murmuring something under her breath. "Alex, I knew you'd come back for me, Alex," she whispered, her eyes unfocused, her mind drifting into a haze of pain and exhaustion. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. I'm not Alex. My name is Jackson," he said gently, hoping to bring her back to the present. But she seemed lost in her own world, her pain too overwhelming for her to process anything else. "Alex," she murmured again, her voice breaking. "You're here. Thank God." Jackson tightened his grip on the steering wheel, unsure of what to say. Whoever Alex was, it was clear he held a special place in her heart. Jackson felt a pang of empathy, understanding all too well the desperation of longing for someone who wasn't there. They drove in silence for several more minutes, the snow falling harder now, making visibility difficult. Jackson's nerves were frayed, but he forced himself to focus, pushing through the icy roads as carefully and quickly as he could. Finally, the lights of the hospital came into view, a welcome beacon in the storm. Jackson pulled up to the emergency entrance and jumped out, waving down a nurse who immediately rushed over with a wheelchair. "She's in labor," Jackson said, his voice urgent. "Her car broke down, and she couldn't make it here on her own." The nurse nodded, moving quickly to help the woman out of the truck and into the wheelchair. "We'll take it from here. Thank you so much for getting her here safely." As the woman was wheeled inside, she looked back at Jackson, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. She reached out a hand, and he took it, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Thank you, Alex," she murmured, a small, content smile on her face as she was whisked away into the hospital. Jackson watched her disappear through the doors, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He hadn't done much, just helped someone in need, but her words lingered with him, echoing in his mind. Whoever Alex was, he meant the world to her, and Jackson couldn't help but wonder about the life she'd lived, the story behind the man she thought she'd seen. He sat in his truck for a few minutes, letting the heater warm him up as he processed everything that had just happened. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a quiet stillness, and he felt a small, strange sense of peace settle over him. As he drove away from the hospital, Jackson felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe he wasn't ready to face the world just yet, but tonight had reminded him of something important, that he still had the capacity to help others, to make a difference, even in small ways. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. Jackson spent the next few days distracted by thoughts of Sophie, the woman he had helped deliver to the hospital. He couldn't shake the image of her face, filled with relief and pain, and the strange words she had whispered in her delirium. Alex. Who was this Alex? And why had she called him that? As the days passed, Jackson found himself questioning everything. His purpose, his past, his future. The mysterious connection to Sophie lingered, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Jackson finally decided to visit the hospital again. He told himself he just wanted to make sure Sophie was doing okay, that she was recovering from the delivery, but deep down, something more was at play. He had a sense that their meeting wasn't just a coincidence, that there was more to her story that he needed to understand. And perhaps it was something that could finally offer him the answers he was searching for in his own life. As he entered the hospital, he saw the familiar nurse from before, her bright smile welcoming him as soon as she spotted him. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her tone warm and friendly. "How's everything? You came to check on her?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice sounding more unsure than he intended. "I wanted to see how she's doing. I helped her out the other night, and she seemed really out of it." The nurse's expression softened as she gestured for him to follow her. "She's doing well now. Just a little tired. She's been asking for you, actually. You've made quite the impression on her." Jackson's heart fluttered a little at the mention of Sophie. He followed the nurse down the sterile corridors, past rooms filled with patients, until they reached a private room near the end of the hall. The door was cracked open, and he could hear the faint sound of a baby crying inside. As he stepped into the room, his eyes immediately found Sophie. She was sitting up in the bed, her face pale but peaceful. The small bundle in her arms let out a soft cry as she adjusted the blanket around the baby. Sophie looked up at Jackson with a tired smile, her eyes a little red, but still warm. "Hey," she said softly, as if she'd been expecting him. "I was hoping you'd come back." Jackson smiled awkwardly, a little out of his depth. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. And, see the little one." She patted the bed next to her. "Come sit. I'd love for you to meet him." Jackson moved cautiously to the side of the bed and looked down at the tiny bundle Sophie was holding, a newborn. His heart skipped a beat at the sight of the baby's wide eyes staring up at him, as if searching for something familiar. For a second, Jackson thought he saw a glimpse of something, a flicker of recognition, but it vanished just as quickly. "His name's Charlie," Sophie said quietly. "Charlie Martin." Jackson froze, his breath catching in his throat. Charlie Martin. The name hit him like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to keep his composure. "That's a strong name," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to keep his face neutral, but inside, a storm was raging. Sophie gave a small, weary laugh. "I thought it was fitting. Martin was my husband's name. Alex's name." Jackson's blood ran cold. Alex. The name was like a haunting melody in his mind, now mixing with the baby's name, Charlie. There was a connection here, one that was beginning to make sense, but also felt entirely out of reach. The whisper of her calling him Alex the night of the storm, the baby's name, it was all too much. "Sophie," Jackson began, his voice low but filled with an urgency he couldn't hide. "The night you were in the truck, in pain, you called me Alex. Why? Why did you think I was him?" Sophie's eyes widened at the question, her expression shifting from confusion to one of hesitation. She lowered her gaze for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully before meeting his eyes again. I'm sorry," Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I was in so much pain. But when I looked at you, I thought you were him." Her voice faltered as she continued. "You two look so much alike, Jackson. It's like you're the same person." Jackson blinked, processing her words. "But I'm not Alex. I'm Jackson. Why would you mistake me for him?" Sophie ran a hand through her hair, clearly frustrated with herself. It's hard to explain. When I first saw you, I felt this strange familiarity, like I knew you, like I had seen you before. And then, when you spoke to me, everything started to blur together. Your voice, your presence, it all felt so much like him. Jackson swallowed hard. The idea that he had somehow reminded Sophie of someone who had been part of her past, the man who had been lost and presumed dead, made his head spin. I don't understand, Jackson said, his frustration rising. You said you had a husband named Alex. You thought I was him, but we're not the same person. Why would you think I was him? Sophie paused for a moment, her eyes distant as if recalling a long-lost memory. Alex and I, we had our struggles. He was always so protective, so stubborn. But we had a connection, Jackson. A bond. And when I saw you that night, with your eyes, your face, it felt like I was looking at him again. It was almost like some part of him had never really left me. She looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's what I felt in that moment. The way you looked at me, like you understood. I thought maybe it was a sign, a miracle. Jackson sat in silence, processing her words. His heart raced, and a strange sensation curled in his stomach. He wasn't Alex. He had no memories of her, no shared history with her. But still, there was something about her, something that pulled him in, made him want to believe there was more to this story than just coincidence. So you really think we looked that much alike? Jackson asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with disbelief. Sophie nodded slowly, her gaze softening as it met Jackson's, a quiet sorrow in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. You both have the same eyes, the same build. Your voices, they sound so alike. It's like I'm looking at him again. It's uncanny. Jackson leaned closer, his voice gentle but filled with an urgency he could not contain. But Alex, where is he when you're in a moment like this? When you need him the most? Sophie's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she wiped a tear from her cheek. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, with a quiet, shuddering breath, she spoke, her voice thick with anguish. Alex is dead, Jackson? Her eyes fluttered closed as if to shield herself from the pain of admitting the truth, the words coming out as a sob she had held back for far too long. Jackson's throat constricted at her words, a pang of sympathy piercing through him. He leaned in even closer, trying to catch her gaze, trying to hold on to some semblance of calm. I'm sorry about Alex, he said softly, though his voice quivered with the emotions he was fighting to keep in check. His words hung in the air, fragile, as if one wrong breath could shatter the fragile moment between them. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the baby in her arms. We had a good life, but things changed after he started working with a man named Eric. Eric was his old friend, someone he trusted, but, well, he changed. I guess everyone changes, don't they? Jackson nodded, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was still blurry, fractured. What happened to him, Sophie? Sophie's eyes darkened, and her voice grew quieter, more distant. One day, Alex went on a fishing trip with Eric. I didn't like it. There was something about it that felt wrong, but Alex trusted him. He always did. After the trip, Eric came back alone. He said Alex had fallen overboard. It seemed like a tragic accident, but she trailed off, her voice faltering. Something about it never felt right. Jackson sat there, his mind reeling. He could feel the weight of the truth hanging in the air between them. Sophie's words rang in his ears, but it was the last sentence that struck him the hardest. Something about it never felt right. Do you think Eric had something to do with it? Jackson asked carefully, his voice tight. Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, her hands trembling as she held Charlie close to her. I don't know. I just know that the man I thought I knew, Alex, wasn't the same after he met Eric. He changed. I couldn't help but feel that he was being pulled into something dark, something dangerous. And now, Now, I'm left with a child to raise alone. Jackson felt a pang of sorrow for Sophie, for the pain she had endured. But he also felt a deep, burning need for justice, for Alex, for the truth, for the chance to right the wrongs that had been done. He looked at the baby in Sophie's arms, at the hope that still lived in those innocent eyes, and something inside him snapped into focus. "I'm going to help you," Jackson said, his voice firm. "I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." Sophie looked at him with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You don't have to." "I want to," Jackson interrupted, a fire burning in his chest. "This isn't over. Not for me, and not for you either." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with unspoken words. "Thank you, Jackson. I don't know what I would do without you." As Jackson left the hospital later that day, a feeling of determination settled over him. He didn't know what he would find when he dug deeper into the past, what truths would come to light, or what dangers he might face. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. For Alex, for Sophie, for Charlie. Jackson spent the next few days haunted by the stories Sophie had shared. Eric's betrayal of Alex, the suspicious drowning, and Sophie's grief weighed heavily on him. As he pieced together what he knew, an unexpected memory resurfaced, one that made him feel both a sense of urgency and apprehension. He had grown up in an orphanage and had always felt a deep, inexplicable void, as though a part of him had been missing. Now, with Sophie's story and the growing suspicion of his own connection to Alex, a single question echoed in his mind. Did he have family out there that he didn't know about? Determined to find answers, Jackson set out to the orphanage where he had spent his early years. The building was tucked away on a quiet street, nestled between rows of towering oaks that seemed to shield it from the outside world. He hadn't been back in years. The sight of the familiar green walls, now faded with age, stirred a mix of nostalgia and unease. Inside, the walls were adorned with photos of children, capturing smiles that hinted at futures filled with hope. Jackson paused in front of a picture of himself from years ago, a little boy with messy hair and wide, curious eyes. He wondered how different his life might have been if he had known he had a twin brother, someone who had been out there living a parallel life. He was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, the headmistress, a kindly woman with warm, wise eyes and a wrinkled smile that held a touch of sadness. Years of caring for countless children had left a deep imprint on her heart. She had come to know their pains, their joys, and often their unspoken fears. Each child left with a piece of her heart, but some memories lingered more poignantly than others. "Jackson! It's been so long," she exclaimed, reaching out to embrace him with a tenderness that reminded him of simpler days. "How have you been, dear?" Jackson managed a small smile, momentarily comforted by her familiar presence. "I've been, well, it's complicated," he replied. "But I'm here looking for answers, Mrs. Thompson. I need to know if I had a brother." Her expression shifted as a flicker of surprise crossed her face. She hesitated, her eyes meeting his with a look that was a mixture of concern and something deeper, perhaps a guarded sorrow. "Why do you ask that, Jackson?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but wary, as though she'd been waiting for this question to come up someday. Jackson took a steadying breath, gathering the courage to speak. "I've learned some things recently, about a man named Alex. He looked exactly like me, Mrs. Thompson, and I think he could have been my brother. I need to know. Please, I have to know." For a long moment, Mrs. Thompson said nothing. She glanced away, her gaze drifting to a small window where the pale winter sunlight filtered in, casting a gentle glow over the worn furniture. Finally, as if making a decision, she rose and walked over to a small cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. Her hands moved slowly, methodically, as she unlocked it and pulled out a faded, worn file. She returned to Jackson, her expression solemn, her eyes conveying a weight of responsibility. "You were right to come here," she said softly, extending the file toward him. "You were not alone when you arrived, Jackson. You had a twin brother." Jackson's heart skipped a beat, and his hands trembled as he took the file. He opened it slowly, feeling an overwhelming mixture of fear, hope, and apprehension. As he scanned the pages, words and dates blurred together until he saw it. A brief entry confirming that he and his twin had been separated. A sense of shock washed over him as the truth he'd suspected took form on the page. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice gentle yet laden with regret. A couple took him in shortly after you were both brought here. They wanted a child and seemed ready for the responsibility, but they divorced a few years later, and I heard they sent him to another orphanage. Jackson's heart sank further as he absorbed her words. The details were sparse, yet they were enough to confirm his worst fear. He had a brother, a twin he'd never known, and that brother could very well have been Alex, Sophie's late husband, the brother he might have had a chance to save. "I'm so sorry, Jackson," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice thick with emotion. "When the couple returned him, we had no space. It was an impossible choice. I thought that maybe, by each of you finding homes, you'd at least have a chance at happiness, even if you weren't together. But you—" Her voice broke slightly. "You cried every night after he left, calling out for someone only you could remember. The bond between twins. It's something beyond words, something that time and distance can't erase. A surge of emotions, anger, sorrow, regret, swelled within Jackson, overwhelming him. His mind spun as he tried to process everything. He'd spent his life alone, always feeling a missing part within himself. And now he realized that his brother, his own twin, had been out there all along. And now, he was gone. Mrs. Thompson reached out, her hand gently resting on his shoulder, grounding him. Her voice was soft, filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen lives fracture and heal countless times. "You've been through so much, Jackson. I can see it in your eyes. But maybe, just maybe, knowing the truth will help you find some peace." Jackson swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I don't know what to do next." "Take it one step at a time, dear," she said gently. "Seek the answers you need, but remember that healing takes time." Nodding, Jackson felt a heavy but renewed sense of purpose forming within him. He had lost his brother, but he hadn't lost his sense of justice. If Eric had been responsible for Alex's death, he wouldn't rest until he brought him to justice. His brother might be gone, but Jackson could still carry his memory forward and fight for him. With a heart heavy with both sorrow and newfound resolve, Jackson thanked Mrs. Thompson and left the orphanage. The building that had once been his only home now felt different, like a place where truths lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. As he stepped onto the quiet street, Jackson felt the weight of his past mingling with his present. He was alone, yet somehow not. He could feel Alex's presence with him, a silent call urging him forward, to carry his memory and somehow to make things right. Jackson returned to the city, his mind racing with the discovery he had just made. The knowledge that Alex, his twin brother, had been torn away from him as a child and possibly killed by someone he trusted added fuel to the fire in his heart. He knew that he had to confront Eric, the man who had betrayed Alex. But this confrontation wouldn't be simple. Eric was close to Martin, a powerful and influential figure in the city. Jackson couldn't just walk in unprepared. His first stop was to visit Sophie. She deserved to know the truth, as painful as it would be. Arriving at her apartment, Jackson took a deep breath before knocking. When Sophie opened the door, she could tell from his expression that something significant had happened. "Jackson, is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. He nodded slightly. "I found something about Alex. Can I come in?" Once inside, Jackson explained everything he had learned at the orphanage. Sophie listened intently, her hands clenching together as she processed the reality that Jackson was Alex's twin brother. "So, you're really his brother," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jackson nodded, a solemn expression on his face. "I never knew. They separated us when we were babies, and we were sent to different homes. I only found out because of you, and because I wanted answers." Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she took his hands in hers. "I can't believe it. I thought I had lost everything, but here you are. It's like a piece of Alex is still here." A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city outside. After a moment, Jackson spoke up, his voice firm and resolute. I can't let Eric get away with this. He was the last person with Alex, and now he's living as if nothing happened. He needs to face the consequences. Sophie nodded, determination shining through her grief. Whatever you need, Jackson, I'll help you. Together they formulated a plan. Jackson would confront Eric under the guise of discussing business, hoping to catch him off guard. Sophie would reach out to Martin's business associates, subtly gathering any information that might incriminate Eric. She knew people from Alex's circles who had dealt with Eric and Martin's company. Some of them might be willing to speak up if they knew the truth about Alex's death. A few days later, Jackson arranged a meeting with Eric, posing as a potential business partner. Eric was intrigued by the prospect, unaware of Jackson's true intentions. They agreed to meet at a trendy cafe in the business district. When Jackson arrived, Eric was already seated, his back straight and his posture confident. He was dressed impeccably, with an air of smugness that only deepened Jackson's resolve. He took a seat across from Eric, keeping his expression neutral. "Jackson, is it?" Eric greeted, offering a calculating smile. "I've heard some interesting things about you." Jackson met his gaze steadily. "Good things, I hope." Eric chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Let's just say, interesting things. So, what brings you to my world?" Jackson paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I wanted to talk about my brother, Alex." The mention of Alex's name made Eric's smile falter, if only for a second. He quickly composed himself, though Jackson didn't miss the slight twitch in his jaw. "Your brother?" Eric asked, feigning ignorance. "Yes, Alex," Jackson replied, his tone sharpening. "You knew him well, didn't you? Worked together, went on a fishing trip together. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive." Eric shifted uncomfortably, but he maintained his cool demeanor. "Look, it was a tragedy, but accidents happen. Alex, he wasn't as careful as he should have been." Jackson leaned in, his voice low and laced with menace. "You're lying, Eric. I know what happened out there. You were angry at him. He told Sophie about how you wanted more control in the business and how he refused to make you a partner. You resented him, didn't you?" Eric's eyes narrowed, and his expression hardened. "You don't know anything," Jackson continued, his tone unwavering. "You saw an opportunity to get rid of him, and you took it. You pushed him overboard, knowing he'd never make it out of the water alive. And now, you're here, living as if nothing happened, expecting that no one would ever find out the truth." A flicker of fear crossed Eric's face, quickly masked by anger. "You can't prove any of that," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "It's your word against mine, and I have Martin on my side. Do you really think anyone will believe you?" Jackson leaned back, a calm smile on his face. "Actually, I don't need them to believe me. I just needed you to admit it." He reached into his pocket and pressed a button on his phone, stopping the recording. Eric's face paled as he realized what had happened. You recorded me?" he stammered, his voice shaking. Jackson's smile widened. "You're right, Eric. It's my word against yours. But with this recording, the police will have more than enough reason to investigate further. And when they do, they'll find the witnesses, the evidence, and everything else you've tried to cover up." Eric's hands clenched into fists, his composure completely shattered. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think this will be enough? Martin will protect me. He has connections, power, more than you could ever understand." Jackson stood as well, his gaze steely. "Then let him try. But you should know, Eric, people like Martin only protect you as long as you're useful to them, and right now, you're more of a liability." Jackson's heart raced as he left the cafe, tightly clutching the recording in his pocket. The confession from Eric that would finally expose Alex's death as more than just an accident. However, the road to justice was far from simple. Eric's connections and Martin's influence made this a battle not just for the truth, but against a system that sometimes bent to wealth and power. Still, Jackson was determined to see it through, to honor Alex's memory at any cost. The next morning, Jackson met Detective Larson, a seasoned officer with sharp eyes, at the police station. Jackson carefully explained how he obtained the confession and handed the recording over to Larson, who listened intently, his face tight with tension. When the recording ended, Larson looked up thoughtfully. "This is compelling, Jackson, But Eric has strong connections. One recording might not be enough. If Martin's behind him, they'll argue it's been tampered with or coerced. Jackson nodded. I understand. But it gives us a reasonable cause to investigate, right? You can dig deeper with this. Look for witnesses or additional evidence to prove what Eric did to Alex. Larson thought for a moment before agreeing to open the investigation. If you find anything else, any more evidence, bring it directly to me. This case is a priority. In the weeks that followed, Jackson threw himself into the investigation. He combed through every clue and returned to the river where Alex's body had been found, hoping to find someone who might have witnessed the events that morning. His persistence paid off when Jackson finally found two elderly fishermen who had been on the river that fateful day. Though initially reluctant, they eventually admitted to seeing two men on a boat, one of whom resembled Alex. They recalled seeing the young man struggling, calling out before disappearing beneath the water. This testimony perfectly matched what Jackson had learned, and with some encouragement, the fishermen agreed to testify. With the fishermen's testimony added to the case file, Larson decided it was time to summon Eric for questioning. Eric arrived at the police station, accompanied by a powerful attorney hired by Martin, his smug expression betraying his confidence. The interrogation room was tense as Larson questioned Eric about his relationship with Alex and the events leading up to that fateful day. Eric dodged, offering well-prepared answers, evading any connection to Alex's death. Behind the two-way mirror, Jackson watched, his frustration growing. As the interrogation seemed to stall, Jackson had an idea. He quickly discussed his plan with Larson, who nodded in agreement. Larson returned to the interrogation room, this time playing the recording for Eric and his attorney to hear. The attorney objected, claiming the recording had been tampered with. The trial that followed was tense. Eric's defense team, backed by Martin's resources, worked tirelessly to discredit the evidence. They argued that the recording had been edited and that the fisherman's testimony was unreliable. The defense was aggressive, and Jackson felt his frustration mount as each trial session passed. But then, one late night while reviewing all the collected evidence, Jackson remembered a small detail. A security camera on the opposite bank of the river might have captured the incident. Jackson immediately contacted Larson, who, after persistent effort, obtained the video. While the quality was poor, it showed the faint shape of two men on a boat that day. One of them, resembling Alex, appeared to struggle, while the other, unmistakably Eric, stood nearby. The video wasn't perfect, but it added weight to the fisherman's testimony. The video was presented in court, bringing new hope for a favorable verdict. The jury watched intently as the prosecutor presented the video, connecting it with the testimony and the recording. Eric's defense began to falter as the pieces fell into place, and they could no longer protect him from the truth. Ultimately, under mounting pressure, Eric's mask fell away. In a fit of desperate anger, he admitted, "All right, yes, I pushed him. He didn't want to partner with me, told me I wasn't trustworthy. He thought he could get rid of me like I was nothing, so, yes, I wanted him gone." The chilling confession sealed Eric's fate. He was arrested, and the efforts of his attorney to downplay the impact of the recording and his confession failed under the weight of the fisherman's testimony and the incriminating evidence. Martin, fearing he would be implicated in the crime, backed away and denied any involvement with Eric, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, a sentence reflecting the calculated betrayal that led to Alex's death. As the gavel came down, the courtroom was filled with murmurs, a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Jackson sighed, feeling the weight of the journey lift. Justice for Alex had finally been served. When the courtroom emptied, Jackson saw Sophie waiting for him. Her face was a mix of relief and sadness, her eyes filled with gratitude. She reached out and took his hand, her voice gentle, yet firm. "It's finally over," she whispered. "Thank you for being with me, for fighting this fight." Jackson looked at her, his eyes full of sincerity. Alex deserved this. He deserved peace, and now we can move forward. Together they walked out, stepping into the crisp winter air. For the first time in months, Jackson felt a deep peace, as though Alex's memory had shifted from sorrow to a quiet, peaceful release. With justice for Alex finally achieved, Jackson felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Yet, As he moved forward, he understood that the road to healing was still long. Sophie, who had been by his side through the trial, now found herself facing the reality of continuing life without Alex. The two of them, bound by shared grief and memories of a life they had both lost, discovered comfort in one another's presence. One cold morning, as they sat by the river where Alex had loved to spend his afternoons, Sophie broke the silence. "Jackson, I want to keep Alex's memory alive in a way that's meaningful. I don't want his work, his dreams, to disappear." Her voice wavered, but there was a determination in her gaze. Jackson looked at her thoughtfully. "We can keep his legacy alive, Sophie. I'll help you with anything you need." Sophie nodded, a sense of hope dawning in her expression. "Alex's car service business, he poured his heart into it. I want to make sure it thrives, to honor him." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I don't know how to run it alone." Jackson smiled gently. "You don't have to. I'll be there every step of the way." Over the following months, Jackson and Sophie worked together to revive the car service business. Jackson, with his background as a mechanic and his understanding of the industry, helped modernize the operations. They introduced new services, streamlined the client management system, and built a strong reputation based on reliability and integrity, the very values Alex had embodied. Working side by side brought Jackson and Sophie closer. They spent long days at the garage, learning the ins and outs of managing a business. Jackson's steady presence reassured Sophie as she navigated the challenges of her new role. And, in the quiet moments when grief would resurface, they found solace in one another. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jackson and Sophie decided to grab dinner at a nearby diner. They laughed over coffee and shared stories, talking about the dreams they once had and the dreams they were now daring to consider. At one point, Sophie looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Jackson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything. I don't know if I would have made it through without you." Jackson reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. This is where I'm meant to be." Their relationship grew quietly, like a seed planted in the dark soil of loss, but nurtured by the light of resilience. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer overshadowed their every moment. Slowly they began to envision a future together, one built on mutual respect, understanding, and the shared experience of rebuilding their lives. 3 months later, as Christmas approached, Jackson and Sophie decided to host a holiday celebration for close friends and neighbors. They decorated Alex's old garage with lights, setting up a small Christmas tree in the corner and hanging garlands around the entrance. Their modest celebration became a lively gathering, with laughter echoing off the walls and the aroma of warm cider filling the air. Mr. Rogers, Jackson's elderly neighbor, arrived with a gift for little Charlie, Sophie's son. The child's laughter and excitement filled the room, bringing warmth and joy to everyone present. Mr. Rogers, who had become a father figure to both Jackson and Sophie, watched the couple with a proud smile. As the evening drew to a close, Jackson raised a toast, his voice filled with gratitude and warmth. "To new beginnings, to the family we find, and to the family we become," he said, looking at Sophie, Charlie, and Mr. Rogers. "Here's to carrying forward the memories of those we've lost and building a future they would be proud of." Sophie, standing beside him, smiled and lifted her glass. "And to everyone here who stood by us, who reminded us that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone." The guests clinked glasses, sharing in the couple's journey from loss to hope. The night was filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of family, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. That Christmas marked the beginning of a new chapter. Jackson and Sophie, having found strength in each other, now looked toward a future together. They knew that Alex's memory would forever be a part of their lives, but they were ready to embrace new dreams, new adventures, and the love that had blossomed amidst the trials they had faced. In the quiet moments of that night, Jackson and Sophie stood side by side, watching the snow fall gently outside the garage window. They held hands, both silently acknowledging the journey they had traveled and the one that lay ahead. For the first time in a long time, they felt the warmth of hope, the promise of a future brightened by love, friendship, and the memory of a life well lived. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.